Hi, this is episode 2 of my series I'm calling Pandemic Musings. How the pressures created by the COVID pandemic have concentrated our minds to enable us to see what the actual truth and reality of our lives have been. So this one is called The Bribe That Sustains Divide and Rule. And I'm going to put it up on my YouTube channel, and to assist me to bring forward further comment and insights, please hit the subscribe button and also the notification button so that you can see when more content comes up. But first of all, let's just start off by considering what this whole thing about divide and rule is. Divide and rule can work on two levels. On the minor level, divide and rule is a situation in which whoever your enemy is fighting the battle on so many fronts that they cannot bring their forces to bear decisively to defend themselves. Okay, so they're spread out all over the place. But that's a low-level form of divide and rule. A higher level, the alpha level of divide and rule, is a situation in which you've got the enemy actively fighting themselves, so that obviously while they're looking at each other and knocking nine shades of you know what out of each other, they don't have time to look up and see where their real enemy lies. Point number one. Point number two. Now let's sort out the dramatis personae in this play that I'm going to lay out before you. On the one hand, you have a bunch of people variously named the cabal, the elite, the globalists, the overlords, the super rich. Call them what you will, I don't really care. But you need to know that we're talking about those people whose wealth is reckoned in billions more than millions, and whose influence goes way beyond their national borders, such that actually it is totally meaningless to think of them as English, French, American, British, German, Russian, Chinese, or whatever. These are the global elites that control everything. Of course, there are very few of these people. By their very nature, by the very definition of who they are, there can't be that many. They are tiny in number. That's side number one. Side number two, the opposition, are you and I, ordinary people, spread out over lots of different countries, say 200 countries in the world, around the world, and all with different interests, all with different levels of resourcing, and so on and so on and so forth. And there is a third line along which our side is divided, and that is the side of ethnicity and race. Okay. Now, the way you get people to fold in front of you is to have them become fearful. But I'll come to that in a minute. At the moment, observing the world as it stands, we have so many false alternatives put in front of us, and they lull us into this notion that we have free will, freedom of speech, democratic systems which we can replace and control, whereas in actual fact, we're not in control of anything, because the alternatives that are put before us are false alternatives. And because we have been so effectively divided and ruled, we can't see that these alternatives are false. Take the political parties in the United Kingdom. You've got the Tory party, and you've got the Labour Party. These are the two major parties historically that over the last 100 years or so have run everything. Now, going into the pandemic, Boris Johnson was leading the Tories, and given the kind of narrative that's being played out on a global basis, whoever is in charge really gives meaning to the expression, possession is 9/10 of the law, because the opposition party looks disloyal, if it gets in the way or obstructs it or too grievously criticizes the party in power. So they've got to do everything that they do in a kind of sotto voce way. So really, here in the United Kingdom, the only real criticism that the opposition party has been able to levy is kind of snapping at the heels of Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson has made a bunch of massive mistakes in the timing of his lockdowns, the extent of his lockdowns, his legislation. There have been many allegations of corruption going on. And of course, if the Labour Party goes too hard on these things, it looks as if you're trying to sink the ship of the state. For God's sake, we got a national crisis going on. Why don't you get on board, shut up, and just support us? And more or less, that's what's been going on. Similarly, in America, the most ridiculous things have been made party political issues. So that actually, you will find that the grandees of the Republican Party, the Bush family, people of that sort, are singing one song. In the old days, they used to call it Pezzo Avanti, the Johnny Come Latelys, the Donald Trumps of the Republican Party, which many people say is the actual Republican Party, are apparently in rebellion against the grandees of the Republican Party. But basically, the Republican Party stands for big business, Wall Street, the banks, the pharmaceutical companies, and the military-industrial complex. So really, it looks as if they're a bunch of marionettes who are making a lot of noise, and it's not really going anywhere. Look on the other side, you got the Democrats. Now, one of the frontrunners for the Democratic Party was Hillary Clinton. Who is Hillary Clinton's current campaign manager? This is a lady who presents herself as an environmental campaigner, as a person who is up for the climate accord, and who is mano a mano kind of at loggerheads with the Republican Party. Her campaign manager used to be the campaign manager of Monsanto. Monsanto is a company with a long written record of abominations in poisoning the environment. So it's very difficult to understand what's going on. Moreover, actually, the amount of funding Hillary Clinton's campaign got from Big Pharma completely trumped, excuse the pun, totally unintended, totally trumped the amount of money the Republican Party got from Big Pharma. So it's very difficult to see what is really going on. It's a little bit like my right hand fighting my left hand, but of course I'm controlling both because the control comes from the brain. So in America, it's much ado about nothing again. In the Second World War, huge American corporations like Coca-Cola had investments in Germany, and they were making soft drinks for German soldiers. IBM, an American business machines company, was working very closely with the research and development work for the Third Reich under Hitler. And of course, American banks were funding both the Allies and Adolf Hitler. So again, it looks like there we are, Churchill on the one hand, Hitler on the other, fighting a tooth and nail with each other, and so on and so forth. And yet the banks funding both came from the same side. So there we are. That's how divide and rule works. It looks as if there's choice and there's real opposition going on in front of you, but in actual fact, all of this is being manipulated by a force which is unseen and off camera. Now, the other thing I've observed, even more clearly under COVID, is that the word you use is hypocrisy and double standards. But the principle behind it is moral relativism, i.e., the standards you apply to one group and their behavior is completely different to the standards you apply to another group and their behavior. So when the West goes around the world and smashes up third world countries so that they're completely destabilized and can't manage their own affairs and labels them basket cases, it's okay. But they would go to war if anybody tried to interfere in their economy like that. A few of their telephone services and infrastructures were hacked by foreign parties, and there was hell to pay. But when they do it, it's okay. I was shocked to read the other day some stats. Research was done with white medical carers, and 50% of them actually believed that the threshold of pain for people who looked like me, was way higher than for people who looked like them. That's a completely different standard based in no fact whatsoever other than labels and stereotypes carefully crafted over the centuries and handed down. So you can see that this moral relativism, this kind of double standards which are applied, and we see it in the judicial process. You have a person of minority ethnic background commit a crime, and you have a person of a European origin commit a crime, and you will find that the sentences that are handed down are totally different. In the dispensation of law and order, the police have always been known in Europe to treat minority ethnics far more harshly. And of course, nobody has to go beyond George Floyd to see what the consequences of that can be and the impacts it can have in society. So there is this moral relativism which applies to enable people to be, whole societies to be divided into different tiers, each with different levels of pressure and expectation and benefit applied, so that naturally they will see each other as adversaries. Now, I come to the subject of this post. My realization, and it should really be obvious, it's just that it's been playing in the background. Without COVID, it wouldn't have been writ as large as it is now. The realization is quite clear. The bribe that keeps humanity. Remember how I define humanity now? The ordinary people, that would be you and me watching this video. The bribe that keeps us at each other's throats at different levels of privilege. And these privileges are hardwired in stone. 1, 2. And we are all encouraged never, ever to talk about them. Moral relativism. So if a person like me talks about racial discrimination, well, he's always talking about these things. He's got a chip on his shoulder, and it doesn't apply to ordinary people being people who are not of African origin in European society, which is probably true, but it is moral relativism nevertheless. Now, by this ingenious, simple, and single device, people of European origin think that people of African origin are their enemies, think that people of Asian origin are their enemies, and vice versa. How the devil does humanity expect to defend itself from a global threat as long as it's been induced by centuries of psychological, cultural, sociological, political, and economic programming to see the other as the enemy? To be honest, the miracle is that we haven't wiped each other out. So if, for example, you were to get a third party, let's say a globalist, who decided that he wanted his way with the rest of us across the world, how on earth would we sit around a table with mutual respect, mutual recognition, mutual empathy, and stand together to fight them off? Within that, of course, don't forget, the bribe of differential privilege runs all the way down the system. Many people feel that, well, what's going on at the moment with the mandation of these experimental biological agents with children being targeted now for this jab that they're going to put in their arms, with children as young as 12 being given the choice to choose for themselves. That talk about moral relativism, talk about how under any and other circumstances a child of 12 can't choose to have sex. It is mandatory rape. A child of 12 can't choose to go to war. That's child soldiering. Both of those are absolute crimes in virtually every territory or legal jurisdiction in the world. And yet they're able to make a life-changing choice, which, once taken, cannot and will not be reversed. Talk about moral relativism. So this is how the bribe of relative privilege works. Some people are encouraged to stay mute. And while they're staying mute, the most appalling abuses of their rights can take place. Now, if we are told and we are encouraged not to stand up for each other's independence, freedom, and dignity, we might as well invite any third party that wants to come and have their way with us to come and have their way with us. And the thing that maintains the differential privileges is fear. People are afraid they're going to lose their exalted positions in society, the exalted privileges which they're being given. And the third thing is they're worried that if they step out of line, they're going to look weird. And so people are going to start criticizing them. All of them are crystallized into this atavistic fear, this kind of gut level, heartfelt fear of standing out and stopping fighting your fellow man. We have made our division our status quo. And as long as that is maintained by those who would seek to have their way with us, we are definitely on a trajectory to being divided and ruled. Now, I'm going to do another post about how to fight this fear, but we need to be absolutely clear that the fear of loss of privilege and the fear that we will be stepping out of the fold of the herd are the two principal fears being leveraged to make sure that we are controlled. Think about it. I'd like to hear actually what your comments are on this thing, because a monologue is a little bit like playing tennis with yourself. I'd like to hear what your thoughts on what I'm saying are, because it's important that we understand each other so that we can protect ourselves from whatever is coming up over the horizon. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great afternoon.